Admiral Turner, it's certainly a pleasure to meet you and get to know you on a very special day as you're inducted into the Lincoln Academy of Illinois.
Thank you, Jack.
I'd like to start at the beginning. Growing up in Illinois, what were your early influences?
Well, my early influences were living in a community, Highland Park, Illinois, north of Chicago, where there were tremendously good schools. My grade school was marvelous, happened to be very small. We had just barely enough boys in the class to make a football team. Then I went to Highland Park High School, which was a marvelous educational opportunity, and I think that gave me a foundation for my future education. Also, the whole Chicago area is a socially and culturally wonderful area where it gives you a foundation for life and for expanding your horizons. I just am very grateful to have had that opportunity to be raised in Illinois.
You were growing up during the World War II days. You went to the Naval Academy. What drew you to the military?
Well, I went to Amherst College in Massachusetts when I graduated from Highland Park High School in 1941. But just a couple of months later, the Japanese changed my plans in life. I intended to go on and become a lawyer, but we all went into the military. And for various reasons, I chose to go in through the Naval Academy into the Navy. I would admit to you that I never thought I was going to stay in the Navy, but it turned out that each time the opportunity came up to get out, something persuaded me to stay in maybe another year or two, and after about 30 years, I decided I'd make a career of it.
Well, your career has certainly embraced a lot of the world's Cold War history. I'd like to talk to you about that some, because you've written extensively on the military. You've written a lot about nuclear weapons, disarmament issues. Tell us a little bit about what the thinking was as we emerged from World War II into the Cold War.
Well, it was just a few months, really, at the end of World War II when we began to perceive that the Soviet Union wasn't going to be a friendly ally anymore as it had been during World War II. And this tremendous suspicion between the countries developed, this tremendous animosity, the feeling on our side that the Soviet Union was out for world conquest. Whether that was true or not, it became an accepted dogma in this country. And our foreign policy really was, if it's good for the Soviets, it's bad for us. So we, I think, intervened in some countries that weren't all that terribly important to us, but we felt that if the Soviet Union was able to gain control over them, it was going to be part of a rolling wave of communism. We probably, in retrospect, overestimated the strength of the Soviet Union. We understood they were not strong economically. We didn't understand that they really had feet of clay politically, that their whole system, because it deprived the individual of any voice in the governmental process, was not sound. And so we went through this whole Cold War period, but the strength of our country, I think mainly because of our standing for the freedom of the human being, prevailed.
You mentioned that the Soviet Union probably wasn't as strong as we gave it credit for. I know in growing up during part of that era, we saw the Soviet Union as this very monolithic, very powerful, hegemonistic, wanting to go out and spread the gospel of communism, very, very powerful state. But it unraveled so quickly.
Well, the Soviet Union did not have a good economic base. They, of course, were really demolished by World War II. In trying to recover from that under a communist economic system, they were doomed, I believe, not to succeed, because the communist economic system did not provide incentives for the individual to work and to work harder. What we misjudged was that even though their economy wasn't strong, they were willing to tighten their belts and put a lot of money into their military. And so we did have to face large numbers of Soviet tanks, Soviet aircraft, Soviet missiles, and that was a true threat. I don't think they could have sustained a war very long, but who wanted a war between two superpowers, each with nuclear weapons? So we were justifiably worried about possible military conflict here. I think what we did not appreciate is that there was a limit to how much they would tighten their belts. And by the 1980s, it was clear that they could not extract more effort out of their labor force because they were giving them no rewards. Even if they gave them more rubles, there was nothing in effect to buy. So the Soviet Union collapsed for lack of support from the citizenry.
We often overestimated their military capabilities, particularly in the 1950s when we talked about a bomber gap, which we later found out really didn't exist once we were able to do overflights and do surveillance. Later on, the missile gap. How did we get it wrong?
Well, there's a lot of hardware out there. And we saw that hardware, and it was easy to count tanks and not count what their capability was adequately. It's a normal tendency of intelligence people, of military people, to say if they've got 20 tanks, they've got 20 tanks worth of capability, because it's very difficult to estimate that those tanks aren't being maintained well, those tanks are really in a reserve division that isn't trained well, or whatever it may be. And I think that led to our overestimation of what their capabilities were. But there's no question about it. The Soviet Union posed a very serious threat to Western Europe, because we worried that even if they didn't have a sustaining power, because they didn't have all the backup and all the economic wherewithal that is necessary, a quick thrust to the English Channel was not out of the question.
How did this thinking translate into the development of our nuclear weapons doctrine?
Unfortunately, throughout this period, we, and then the Soviets followed in our model, tried to treat nuclear weapons as though they were larger conventional weapons. If the enemy has 10 tanks, you want to have 12. And that's a reasonable doctrine. If the enemy has 10 nuclear weapons, that doesn't mean you need 12, because they are so powerful that at some point, and you can have different numbers in mind, but at some point you just can't use anymore. There's only a limited amount of destruction that you really want to do. Today, we have 15,000 nuclear warheads in the United States, and the Soviets have over 20,000. It's an oversimplification, but can you imagine the Soviets inflicting 20,000 Hiroshimas on the United States? I mean, it's just beyond imagination. It's beyond any sense of reality. Well, if we decided if they had 10, we needed 12, they decided if we had 12, they needed 14. And this thing cascaded up to where between the two of us, there were over 70,000 nuclear warheads in the world. It was absolutely absurd. But it was extrapolating a concept of conventional warfare into this new field, because we did not appreciate how generically different these weapons were.
Let's talk about how generically different they are. When you were off the coast of Vietnam in, I believe it was the late 60s, early 70s, when you were in command of a missile cruiser, you had nuclear weapons at your disposal if you needed to use them. But you surmised that after thinking through, you couldn't really use them. They weren't practical.
Well, if I had fired my nuclear weapons, which in this case were against airplanes, we didn't have them to shoot at land, we had them to shoot in defense of our ship or our task force. But the electronic impact of detonating a nuclear weapon out there would have just put my radars and all this other electronic equipment out of operation, at least for some period of time. I might have hit down the first aircraft or the first group of aircraft, but I might have just been sitting there totally naked for the next one.
Well, the electromagnetic pulse effects, one weapon detonated over a continent could knock out practically everything electronic throughout that hemisphere almost.
If you decide that's what you want to do and you design the weapon and place it that way, we estimate that a single nuclear weapon over the center of the United States, I mean, probably right over Champaign, Illinois, would knock out electrical and electronic capabilities all across the country. Not all of them, but lots of them.
Why weren't we thinking along those lines? That we talked about using them as deterrents, and there are various and sundry theories on how it worked or didn't work. But why didn't we think of that in practical terms? We certainly tested enough of them.
Yes, I think the issue here goes back to politics, because the animosity towards and the suspicion of the Soviet Union was so great that no political leader could stand up and say, I'm going to let the Soviets have more nuclear weapons than we. And although it made no sense militarily for us to keep building nuclear weapons beyond any possible need for them, it was politically impossible to let them best us in any category: economic, political, military.
We fast forward now to today. The Soviet Union no longer exists, but yet we still have tens of thousands of nuclear warheads about. The United States has them. Former Soviet states still have them. And of course, new players on the block. You've written extensively about trying to rein this in. Where should we go from here? What's a logical approach?
Well, the problem today is that for 30 years we've been trying to reduce the numbers of these weapons, because there's no rational person who thinks 37,000 nuclear warheads between the United States and Russia today is desirable or necessary. Certainly, no matter how you approach nuclear weapons, those numbers are just inordinate. Now, we've tried through a treaty process to reduce these, and we've done well. We've done well in the relative. We have half as many nuclear warheads today as we had 10, 12 years ago. But half is still 37,000, and that's just unconscionable. And we're not going down in the absolute fast enough, because our country is totally vulnerable to having the society just decimated. Not because the Soviets have 20,000 warheads, not because they may someday have 10. It's totally vulnerable at 500. I mean, imagine the 500 largest cities in the United States, each a Hiroshima. Imagine the 50 major cities in the United States a Hiroshima. And yes, Hiroshima was a small bomb compared with the ones that are aimed at us by the Russians today. So the process of getting down in the absolute to really reasonable numbers is going at a snail's pace. The present program, the best our government has concocted, is a treaty called START II. We began negotiating that 12 years ago. It is still not ratified by the United States Senate or the Soviet Russian Duma parliament. If it is ratified and it is carried out, it'll take this number of 37,000 warheads down to 20,000. That's no significant difference. And it won't do it until the end of 2007, 8 years from now. I say that's just totally unreasonable.
What's the alternative you propose?
The alternative I propose is called strategic escrow. tomorrow morning, Mr. Clinton calls the commander of our strategic command just to the west of here in Offutt Air Force Base in Omaha, Nebraska. And he says, General, I want you to take 1,000 warheads off of our missiles. And I want you to move them into storage space about 1,000 miles away, 100 or 200 miles away. Enough that you can't just move them back quickly. Now, I, Mr. Clinton, am going to invite Mr. Yeltsin to put observers there. They have no authority other than to count what goes in and if anything comes out. We then hope that the Russians will do the same. They may or may not. But they're under a great pressure to do so, because their defense minister announced last October that because they have not been able to afford to maintain and refurbish their nuclear establishment, that within about 10 years they're going to be down to only 500 deliverable nuclear weapons. They cannot let a discrepancy develop between their having 500 and our having 5, 10,000 or whatever it may be. So I think they'll come along in time. If they do 1,000 after we do 1,000, we'll do another 1,000. They'll do another. This does not get rid of the weapons. It just makes them not immediately available. If we find the Russians are cheating, we can bring ours back. Mm-hmm. But in a very few years, 3, 4, we could have our 2 arsenals to where there were only a few hundred nuclear weapons actually ready to fire. We go ahead and keep trying by treaties to destroy the excess numbers that are in storage until we get ourselves down to a few hundred warheads all in storage. We get the other nuclear powers and push them in this direction, and we have a world then, maybe in a decade, where there are no nuclear weapons immediately ready to fire, and only a couple of hundred for each of the nuclear powers, let's say. It's a very stable and safe world. We're not subject to accidents or miscalculations, somebody pushing a trigger out of order. But also, what if somebody cheats like Saddam Hussein and builds a nuclear weapon or 2 and starts to threaten his neighbors? We still have our couple of hundred in storage. We can bring them back and say, look, Saddam Hussein, you're not anything special. You know, you've got 10, 20 nuclear weapons, whatever you've built, but we're together ready to just eliminate you if you use them. So we now have an insurance against people abusing these nuclear weapons. Even one of those nuclear powers that has them in storage, if they start putting them back together and threatening people with them, the rest of them put them back together and say, come on, look out, you're nobody special.
And it's something that by and large we can, through technology, start to ascertain what the situation is. And that was one of the things you worked with when you went to head the Central Intelligence Agency, talking about the spy satellites and the overflight technology that we have. I'd like to talk a bit about your term at CIA. You were called to the post by then President Jimmy Carter. What was the state of the agency in the 1970s when you arrived?
Well, in the 2 years before Jimmy Carter took office, there had been 3 major investigations of the CIA, 2 by the Congress and 1 by President Ford. And they'd uncovered some things the agency had done in its past, which were not what I think we want any government agency to do. Now, I think at the time they were done, the American public might well have approved of them because of this Cold War mentality. But nonetheless, by the mid-'70s, I think we understood that we were winning the Cold War and we could rein in the CIA. And so they reined it in. But the CIA professionals were really very distraught because they had been soundly criticized by the media of this country. Now, I sympathized with that because I was a military officer, and we went through that same thing during Vietnam. I suspect the students on the University of Illinois campus here in ROTC did not wear their uniforms around the campus because that was the way it was in those days. So President Carter's job and my job was to revive the morale of the CIA, while at the same time undertaking the very difficult task of getting them to accommodate to the congressional demand for greater oversight, for greater insight into what was going on in the CIA. And the professionals in the CIA, very understandably, were quite wary of telling a congressional committee, this is what we're doing with this spy here and that spy there, because spies' lives can be at risk if you tell too much about them, give them any identification. So it was a very difficult time in the CIA's history to accommodate to the law of the country while maintaining our capability to do good, effective spying work.
How did you win the credibility that you needed to carry out that goal?
Well, you had to be absolutely forward with the Congress. You had to be able to go to the Congress and say, members of this committee, you have asked me a question. I would prefer not to answer that because I'm concerned that it will give away some information about how we collect our data. That is, the identity of an individual, the technical capabilities of a satellite or an electronic listening system. But, ladies and gentlemen, I assure you that you'd be proud of what we're doing and that it's not violating the law, it's not violating a standard of ethics that you would not want us to go beyond. But they've got to trust you. And that's a matter of your personal chemistry with them and how much you have been willing to push the limits so that they have got as much information as you can possibly give them. Because you can never get the Congress to say, there's some limit that you don't have to give us. They are entitled to everything you know, but it's dangerous to tell them that, and you've got to persuade them not to ask you some questions.
What is the trick involved, or what is the way that the United States should balance its interests in preserving its integrity, its safety as a nation, against individual rights, against, I suppose, that sort of integrity in having an agency like the Central Intelligence Agency?
Well, first of all, you've got to obey the law. The CIA is not above the law of this country. And unfortunately, in subsequent times after President Carter left office, the agency flaunted the law. And we had the Iran-Contra affair. We had another number of other scandals in which the agency was not complying with the laws of the country. And that's just totally unacceptable. If the Congress passes laws that make it impossible to do good intelligence, you still have no choice. You've got to obey the law. But you've got to go back and point out to them why it was an inadvisable law. But you can't just flaunt it. Secondly, the President and the Director of the Central Intelligence Agency must set certain standards of ethics. There have got to be levels that you won't stoop below. One of them that's very much on discussion today is, do you assassinate people? Do you assassinate Saddam Hussein? Do you assassinate Milosevic in Yugoslavia? And every president since President Ford has had a written directive said, no, we won't do that. That's a level of ethics below which we don't want to go. Why? Well, because it is unethical, too unethical. But also because, as a pragmatic matter, if we start in that game, our president is very vulnerable, and we won't go to his dirty tricks as will other people. So the president and the chief of intelligence have to set a standard of ethics below which we won't go. That's nebulous, it's hard to do, but it's the key element to what you're suggesting.
But just a moment, I need to ask, how much tape do we have left? 5 minutes. 5 minutes? Okay. As we are conducting this interview today, we of course have military forces at work in the Balkans and trying to remedy the situation in Kosovo. It is the latest in a series of involvements that we've had as a nation after the Cold War. As the only remaining superpower left, what should be our role? We talk about being a global policeman. How do you envision the appropriate role for the United States after the Cold War?
I think we have to take situations like Kosovo, like Rwanda, like Somalia, like other areas where we have either intervened or not intervened when there were heinous cases of inhumanitarian behavior, genocide and such. And we have to ask in each case, do we, the United States, have an interest in stopping this? How important is that to us? We then have to also ask, if we do go in to try to stop genocide, for instance, can we do it? What is the practical aspect of this? And we then have to just weigh the issues. There's lots of genocide going around in the world, besides in Kosovo, and we're not intervening in all of it. So the issue here was, because this is in the Balkans, because this is in the backyard of our European allies, is it that important to us? We have to acknowledge that we're ignoring genocide in Kyrgyzstan, for instance. But we are going to take it on in Kosovo because of its proximity to our other vital interests in Europe. I think that was the argument for going in. The second part of my criteria, could we do something about it, is a lot more questionable in Kosovo.
No doubt about that. About 3 minutes left, would you say?
Actually less than that.
Okay. Need to start to wrap this up. As you look back on your career, and you're still active in writing and researching, what do you think your lasting contribution will be in understanding the way that we conduct ourselves as a military power and as a democracy?
Well, I hope that during my time in the CIA, I contributed to the sense of democracy. I believe strongly that we had to find a way to comply with the congressional laws. I found it important also to try to inform the American public more about what the CIA does. You certainly can't tell the inner secrets, but we opened up a great deal during my time in saying, here's what you're paying for. You've got $28 billion a year out there. Now, here, American public, is what we're doing for you with it. Sometimes we miss it, sometimes we make it, but here's the benefit. So I'm very hopeful that my time in government has helped to strengthen the democratic process.
Of what are you most proud of and what you've been able to do?
Well,
what's given you the most satisfaction?
It turns out the greatest satisfaction I have is from reforming the Navy's War College. I took a very dull curriculum and threw it out completely when I became president of the War College in 1972. We were involved, as you know, at that time in Vietnam. I was trying to teach these officers to think about, well, what are the pros and cons of our being in Vietnam? If I introduced a course on Vietnam, it would all be emotional. They'd all been there and they'd fought, they'd been wounded. So I introduced a course on the Peloponnesian War of the 4th century BC. The Athenians sent a large expedition way overseas to Sicily, and they took on a minor power, Syracuse. They thought they could beat up on them easily, but they had trouble, so they sent more troops, and they sent more troops, and they finally got beaten, and the people at home got disaffected, and the government was defeated. The students didn't understand at first that they were studying Vietnam in the guise of the Peloponnesian War. And anyway, the curriculum that we built from there on is still there today and has benefited military officers for these 27 years since then, and I'm very proud of that heritage that is there.
One question I always like to ask of the Lincoln Laureates is, as a native Illinoisan, what does this award mean to you?
Well, it's very touching to be recognized by your home state. It's very wonderful that the state of Illinois has created not a governmental operation, but a freestanding operation to honor its people. And it's a tremendous thrill to me because although I've not lived in Illinois most of my life, I feel my roots are here. I feel the foundation for everything I've done came from Illinois. And I'm very proud of being an Illini.
We're very proud of having you here.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your time, and best of luck to you in years to come. And it's been very good meeting and talking with you.
Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.